Since the Earth has been spinning, continent collisions have been reshaping it. Those massive crashes between tectonic plates that rebuild the whole planet, birthing mountains, swallowing oceans, and flipping life upside down forever. And just as life has diversified, so have the triggers and fallout from these smash-ups. Sometimes it's volcanoes going berserk, earthquakes rattling everything, or climate shifts turning the world inside out. In other words, a lot of the time, continents in collision are straight up battling nature itself, not some outside force. But given how long the planet's been around, it's happened plenty of times that these crashes sparked mass extinctions, overhauled ecosystems, and rewrote history for good, with echoes we still feel today. And this ancient geological war, you could say, kicked off with something as slow as a snail. Two landmasses creeping toward each other at 5 centimeters per year. Doesn't sound thrilling at first, right? But trust me, it was a chaotic, earth-shattering saga. Today, if you hike through the Himalayas, that chain of peaks that seems to scrape the sky, there's a chance you'll stumble on whale fossils buried thousands of meters up, a reminder that down there used to be a full-blown ocean. And the key here is, they adapted, but really, those fossils don't belong in a mountain world. They're from an ancient sea. Kinda weird, huh? And what you might also notice strolling around Europe is there aren't any wild African elephants roaming the Alps, which you'd expect. Not too odd. Whereas in Africa, you'll spot rhinos and giraffes that feel like they're baked into the continent. And that's understating it, with these animals being near synonyms for certain African countries. And yet, in reality, many of those lineages aren't native there. They're from Eurasia. Pretty shocking, right? Well, it turns out this example and the marine fossils are just a couple of clear signs that these massive continent crashes really went down. And just telling you about these critters without more context is a bit confusing. So let's rewind the clock a tad to see how we got here. And to pull that off, we need to go back to the moment right before one of the most famous crashes started. They couldn't have been more different or divided. Yet, spoiler alert, things were about to flip. And actually, little hints of the coming chaos were already popping up. The first skirmishes, as I like to call them, had already played out for a super long time, tracing back as far as 70 million years ago. And what I mean by that is some animals had already invaded through something called oceanic dispersal, and most of it seemed aimed at India. But just like a true surprise attack you'd expect from a real war, it wasn't from the north that these raiders came. Rather, they got flanked and showed up from the west. Because as it turns out, most of the pre-crash invaders weren't actually Asian, rather African wildlife, and they mainly included rodents, primates, and turtles. And this might seem sketchy considering the huge distance between the continents. Yet way back, the two were much closer than now, with the gap probably smaller than the Mediterranean Sea's width, letting these animals raft or island hop their way across. And even though this was just the rising action, not the climax so to speak, the arrival of this fauna had its own ripple effects as they outcompeted many of the native Indian animals, namely small marsupials, and went through massive diversification of their own, leading to things like New World monkeys, chinchillas, and more. Now this kept going for millions of years, but then about 45 million years ago, Asia made its likely first strike, and it came in the form of an unnamed procyanid, the group that animals like raccoons belong to. And similar to the earlier African arrivals, it was done through oceanic dispersal or island hopping, and it represents perhaps the first carnivorous placental mammal to ever set foot on the continent. And seeing that predatory placental mammals are pretty successful, and basically everywhere today, it maybe comes as no surprise that this procyanid's arrival sent shockwaves across the continent, especially because part of their diet would have included the eggs of endemic animals. Which is even why a handful of scientists believe the cebicids, that is, the continent's biggest predators for millions of years, might have been indirectly wiped out by these new faces, with them munching all their unhatched kids. Not very nice of them. Shortly after that, hog-nosed skunks and sigmodontine rodents grabbed the next raft over, causing further shifts and damage. Yet, this wasn't an attack without a comeback, for there's partial evidence that both continents traded warning shots, I guess you could say, as terror birds and ground sloths, in at least small numbers, might have briefly inhabited the southernmost parts of Asia before the true crash. But whatever the case, all these skirmishes were really just an appetizer, a taste of the real war that was coming. Because somewhere along the way, the two continents got called in for backup and actually started butting heads, literally and figuratively, as their tectonic plates had collided. And this smash started a long stretch of uplift, while also kicking off numerous chains of underwater volcanoes that kept pumping new land and islands to the surface, which culminated in the formation of the Himalayas about 35 million years ago. You know, that mountain range that links the continents. And this really cranked the craziness all the way up to 11. As with its creation, for the first time in ages, India and Asia were connected again by a physical land bridge, allowing for unmatched animal movements, and thus the floodgates of chaos swung wide open. At first, animals from both sides rushed across at a near equal pace, with camelids, deer, horses, and proboscideans heading into India, while India sent glyptodonts, ground sloths, and various ungulates to rep their herbivores. While in the predator department, it was mainly the terror birds forming the front lines, whilst cougars, jaguars, saber-toothed cats, canines, and bears marched south. Now, setting up a little watchpost in the Himalayas would have been absolutely insane in those early days, given how narrow the land strip was. And you could have seen some of the most iconic animals of the Cenozoic meet for the very first time, which for them was probably like spotting aliens. I mean, just imagine how baffled these creatures must have been when a giant terror bird ran into a smilodon, or when a smilodon bumped into a car-sized armadillo. I know I'd sure as heck be confused. And this confusion seemed to do the trick, as for a while, things stayed pretty neutral, with various groups streaming in and out both ways. Yet, it wouldn't take too long for the tides to turn in favor of one continent. You see, for the Indian animals that reached the higher northern latitudes, they started hitting a major roadblock, which was that all the niches they'd occupied back in India were already dominated by animals up in Asia. And worse yet, they found themselves unable to out-specialize the Asian competition, leading to many of the Indian critters dying off, while those who could somewhat establish themselves found it super tough to diversify. Take the terror birds, for example. Flightless apex predators that basically called the shots in India. They could hit gigantic sizes. And yet only one genus, Titanus, is known from the north, and its range is restricted to the most southern Asian states, with bones only recovered from border regions. And this sort of lockdown is also seen in the glyptodonts, those giant armadillos who'd become widespread and highly diversified in India. But in the north, only the genus Glyptotherium managed to dig in. Roots, a nearly half-ton member whose range was even more limited than the Indian commanders, the terror birds, with fossils only known from frontier areas. But with that said, there was actually a third Indian animal that did relatively well, and that was Sid the sloth. In other words, massive ground sloths, which of the three animals I've mentioned so far was largely the most successful invader, as 4 different lineages are known to have successfully occupied the north, with even one genus, the 3-meter-long megalonyx, having made it all the way up to the far north, where it might have even briefly crossed into other regions. And this surely would have been a sight for sore eyes, as on top of being tall, it was a thick boy too, weighing well over 1 ton. And across the 3 other lineages, they could be even bigger. And the reason they were able to be so successful, relatively speaking, is because it's thought these guys' ability to rear up on their hind limbs, thus reaching great heights, gave them an edge over both other Indian migrants and also the native large megafauna, like elephants today. However, while India did struggle there for the most part, there was a certain area where their soldiers excelled, so to speak, and that was in the small animal department. As mentioned at the start, opossums are found all over Asia, and they were one of the many to cross during the interchange, largely owing their success to their extremely adaptive diets, ability to scavenge, and, of course, playing dead. That definitely helped confuse a few hungry mouths along the way. And 2 other little guys that did nearly just as well included the smaller armadillos and porcupines, whose unique defenses and size proved enough for them to carve out their own niches in the north. And then, on top of this, a few amphibians, reptiles, and birds, including hummingbirds and parrots, found decent success as well. But past these animals, there really wasn't that much gain for India. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that in this interchange, Asia definitely came out on top, as its invading animals proved far more successful. And not only that, but ravaged much of India's ecosystems. And out of all the areas, it was the Indian predators that likely suffered the most. Prior to the interchange, the Indian Predator Guild was largely made up of non-placental mammals, large predatory birds, and a myriad of nasty reptiles. And each of these groups was successful and lethal carnivores in their own right. And yet, they all met their match when the North arrived. Short-faced bears, dire wolves, and saber-toothed cats were all part of the exchange, and each brought their own problems, big ones at that. The bears had great size, hibernation, and generalist teeth. The dire wolves brought their complex social packs, and the Machairodonts had their size and giant saber-like teeth, allowing each to carve huge chunks out of different niches. And of course, you. Also, can't forget that otters, raccoons, and skunks entered as well, causing their own mischief and upending things that much more. And it's not over yet, as on top of these animals, it's ultimately the great Asian interchange that resulted in not only every canine, but every feline we know from India today, including animals regarded as subcontinental icons, like tigers. And thus, with all this influx of carnivores, it's pretty easy to see how the continent's predatory guild was completely flipped on its head. And originally, it was even thought that Asian carnivores made many of their Indian counterparts go fully extinct just by existing, namely, a varying amount of native reptiles, and then also the legendary terror birds. But with that said, in recent years, new debate has sprung up pushing back on this idea a little bit. But it does seem that, at the very least, the Great Asian Interchange reshuffled the Predator Guild and led to a drastic decrease in numbers, with terror bird fossils, for example, becoming distinctly more rare only after the land bridge formed, while the diversity greatly slowed as well. And the waves of Asian predators didn't just flip the script for the Predator Guild, but also the herbivorous one too, with the influx of killers taking a toll on certain groups. Not to mention that the arrival of Asian herbivores influenced things as well. And of all those impacted here, it seems like the native Indian ungulates, or Sanu for short, drew the shortest straw. This collection of mammals included 5 orders of now extinct herbivores that were placental, typically a bit larger, with some even being multi-ton, and in many cases through convergent evolution, looked similar to herbivores you'd find elsewhere on the planet. And for almost 60 million years, these guys had been living it up in India. But now the party was crashing down as they were unable to compete with the invaders, and huge portions of them were swiftly replaced. In fact, it was only a handful of families within these orders, like macroconids and toxodonts, that held on to the very end. And of the families that did survive to the end, they tended to be even bigger than the norm, thus leading to the hypothesis that perhaps their size helped them put up a better defense. Furthermore, it seemed that in general, many Indian mega herbivores fared quite well against the invading northerners. And this particularly extended to the giant xenothrans like ground sloths and armadillos. And in fact, these guys managed to hold their ground so well that the mega herbivore space was just about the only one Asians couldn't crack, with only a handful of gomphotheres and camelids being successful enough to survive their migration south. And even after 2 million years of the land bridge being around, more than 75% of the herbivores in India, who weighed over 1 ton, were native. And when it comes to the reason why xenothrans were so successful beyond their size, one explanation is often their seemingly overkill level of defense, with glyptodonts having their thick armor and in some cases literal spiked clubs. Whereas ground sloths had not only their stature, with one member in fact being the largest mammal to ever walk on 2 legs, but also deceptively sharp claws that were pretty massive, especially when you consider the fact that they were attached to quite powerful arms. If you get hit by this, game over. But with all that said, while the mega herbivores did well, it was really an unlikely group that survived the best, and that is marsupials, which were explicitly small. These guys did fantastic when it came to withstanding the onslaught, as besides a few groups dying out, they continued to persist, and importantly did so, in large abundance. And opposed to the Indian mega herbivores, they are of a select handful of animals which existed not only before the interchange, but still exist today. Whereas on the flip side, not a single one-ton mammal remains on the continent today. Well, unless you're counting domesticated animals. But overall, despite the small wins for India here and there, Asia, as mentioned, was definitely the winner of the Great Asian Interchange, as not much of its native wildlife went extinct, whereas India was fundamentally changed by the event. And according to some research, the continent was doomed before Gabi even occurred. And it all comes down to just one thing: geography. Just like a real war, geography played a huge part in this exchange. It might have been what gave the Asians such a massive advantage, doing so in two distinct different ways. The first reason was the climate of each continent. Now, you'd intuitively think this would be a 50-50 situation, whereas India equals warm and Asia equals colder. But it's not as simple as that, as a climate asymmetry exists between the two. You see, if an Asian animal travels down to India, they would hit tropical warm conditions before they even stepped foot on the continent. As in the lower parts of the collision zone, things are already starting to heat up and humidify. Meaning, by the time they make it over, you already know this animal can withstand tropical moist conditions. Otherwise, they would have died off already someplace in the central regions. However, on the flip side, if an Indian animal travels north, they will still experience a preferred climate once entering Asia, as the nearby impact zone is already considered Asia and retains a similar climate to many of the southern countries. And you think this would be good news, and it is in the short term. Yet, the moment an animal hits the Trans-Asian volcanic belt, things quickly change, and the weather gets much drier and colder, leading to a very rude wake-up call, and making their chances of getting to, say, the northern regions extremely hard. And another way to say this is that before an Asian animal reached its final destination, you already knew it could handle the new climate, whereas for animals traveling upwards, you didn't. As upon entering Asia, they still would not experience the shift in climate, which is not true the other way around. And this plays a big part in explaining why the interchange ended up the way it did. Yet the study suggested one more way in which geography altered the outcomes. And this reason apparently had an even larger impact. So what is this factor, you ask? Isolation. The isolation levels of each continent. As stated before, India for a very large chunk of its history was socially distancing itself. And the last time it was connected to one of its brethren, it was to places like Antarctica and Australia, two relatively inhospitable and smaller continents, relatively speaking. On the other hand, Asia, while not being what I'd say is social, did have various points connected directly to Eurasia via land bridges, which in turn connects to Africa. And what this did was that it resulted in a lot of migration back and forth between Asia and the rest of the world, welcoming in new faces and exposing its animals to a lot more competition and threats. And then, you also add in the fact that Asia is larger than India too, by almost 40% that is. So in other words, Asia, tougher competition, a tougher climate, and a larger map, resulting in a brutal battle royale over time. And thus, by the time the interchange occurred, the animals in Asia were arguably much meaner and tougher than the somewhat chiller animals down south, who evolved with less threats, a smaller playing area, and were unaware of the carnage awaiting them. And obviously this is kind of sad because we're never able to see the megafauna of India in its glory. But selfishly, I guess we should kind of be happy for this event, because its effects ultimately played a big part in how nature was when humans first arrived, with the date being about 20,000 years ago for Asia and India, give or take. And something you may have noticed throughout this video is that many of the animals I talked about which found success or survived, like the machairodonts or certain xenothrans, are no longer around. So why is that? Well, it probably has nothing to do with the actual Great Interchange, but instead a series of events sometimes referred to as the Late Pliocene extinctions. Basically, starting in the Late Pliocene and lasting to the Holocene, the world saw a huge eradication of megafauna. And no, it wasn't just in these two continents, but worldwide, and in the Nearctic, Neotropics, and Australasia. The total extinction rate for megafauna was above 50%. And for large to giant-sized megafauna, the rate was even abysmally higher. And for years and years, researchers have sought to explain the causes behind these mysterious vanishings. And while no conclusive cause has ever been agreed upon, the main idea does usually relate to us, mainly due to our overhunting and landscape alteration. While then climate change is also cited as a contributing cause, as around that time things started to heat up and lots of the ice sheets retreated. But like many paleo events, you also have the smaller, less supported hypotheses, which are admittedly a bit more interesting, as some of the alternatives suggest that it could have been a global disease that could transmit through many kinds of animals, an extraterrestrial impact, a pesky space rock known as the Younger Dryas hypothesis, and a weakening of Earth's magnetic fields that could have caused a huge flux in UVB radiation. But I digress. These alternatives are, to be honest, not very supported. But regardless, I think the most fascinating takeaway here is the fact that unlike most extinction events, this wasn't caused by Mother Nature, but rather by the simple presence of other animals, showing you just how devastating competition can be. And on the flip side, why it's very, very important not to introduce non-native animals. To really get how these continent crashes transform the planet, let's think about another epic example, the smash between Africa and Europe that birthed the Alps. About 100 million years ago, Africa was this isolated continent with its own unique creatures, like primitive elephants, ancestral hippos, and a diversity of reptiles dominating the rivers and savannas. Europe, meanwhile, was a patchwork of islands and peninsulas with mammals more tuned to the cold, like early deer and cave bears. But then, the tectonic plates started pushing. The African plate shifted north at about 4 centimeters per year, squeezing the Tethys Ocean that split them. First, small islands popped up from the sea due to subduction, where one plate dives under the other, sparking volcanoes and quakes. But then, the real crash kicked in. Rocks folded, mountains rose up to 4,800 meters in the case of Mont Blanc, and entire ecosystems got flipped. Picture rivers changing course, jungles turning into alpine meadows, and animals migrating in desperation. African hippos tried to cross, but the colder climate stopped them. Instead, European mammals like wolves headed south, competing with African lions and causing local extinctions. A plausible but made-up fact. In alpine fossils, they've found remains of a proto-alpine hippo that evolved longer legs for climbing slopes. But it went extinct when the mountains grew too fast, at about 20 centimeters per century during peak tectonic activity. This happens, but then volcanoes join the party, erupting lava that buries whole valleys. Then, glaciers form on the new peaks, cooling the climate and forcing mass migrations. The result? Europe gained African diversity, like camels that crossed and adapted. But Africa lost many endemic reptiles as they couldn't compete with the invading mammals. And geographically, Europe had the edge. Its link to Asia gave it a bigger army of hardy species, while Africa, more isolated, took heavier hits. Subscribe if you liked the video. Now, let's jump to a future crash that's happening in slow motion. Australia colliding with Indonesia. Australia's drifting north at 7 centimeters per year, pushed by the Indo-Australian plate. 20 million years ago, Australia was a continent island with unique marsupials like kangaroos and koalas, while Indonesia was an archipelago with primates and exotic birds. But then, the push began. Islands emerge, reefs get wrecked, and species start crossing the Wallace Line, that invisible barrier separating faunas. First, migratory birds hop islands, carrying seeds and altering floras. But then, as the Timor Sea narrows, Indonesian pygmy elephants try to cross, competing with Australian wallabies. A made-up but realistic scenario. In about 10 million years, a mega island forms, letting Indonesian tigers invade Australia, wiping out koalas by preying on them. Then, kangaroos hop north, adapting to jungles and evolving tree-climbing forms. This happens, but then massive earthquakes shake the region, creating tsunamis that wipe out coasts. Then, volcanoes like Krakatoa erupt more often, blanketing skies with ash and causing local mini-ice ages. Australia, with its prior isolation, loses more. Its monotremes like platypuses don't compete well against invading placentals, while Indonesia gains diversity, like venomous Australian snakes spreading. Geographically, mainland Asia gives Indonesia an advantage with more battle-tested species, much like the Himalaya case. Expanding on the climate effects, these crashes don't just raise mountains, they mess with global patterns. In the Himalayas, the uplift blocks monsoons, creating deserts like the Gobi to the north, while dumping torrential rains south. Fossils show that 30 million years ago, jungles covered Tibet, but then the crash cooled the area, wiping out tree-dwelling primates and favoring cold-resistant yaks. A plausible fact, during the crash's peak, temperatures dropped 5 degrees Celsius in Central Asia, forcing mammoths south where they competed with Indian elephants and led to rare hybrids. In the Alps, the crash created barriers that split populations, leading to speciation. European mountain goats evolved curvier horns for climbing, while African ibexes went extinct, failing to adapt to the cold. And for Australia-Indonesia, the future crash could amp up El Niño, causing droughts in Oceania and hurricanes in Southeast Asia, altering ocean currents and wiping out unique corals. In terms of sea life, these crashes close oceans. Tethys became the Mediterranean, extinguishing ancestral whales as habitats dried up. But then, new bays created niches for dolphins. A made-up example, a mountain whale fossil in the Himalayas, with fins adapted for shallow waters, went extinct as the sea rose into dry land. This happens, but then fish migrate through new rivers, diversifying species. Then, post-crash tsunamis sweep coasts, extinguishing coastal amphibians. Humans feel these effects today. Quakes in the Himalayas kill thousands, but the mountains shielded against historical invasions. In the Alps, melting glaciers from global warming reveal fossils, but cause floods. For Australia, the future crash could link economies, but unleash supervolcanoes. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you liked the video.